The summer Isobel turned 29, she finally understood what silence could mean in a marriage. Not the comfortable kind of silence, the kind that settles between two people who have said everything worth saying and are simply resting in the aftermath of it. Not that. The silence inside the Hargrove house on Meridian Street in Richmond, Virginia, in the year 1889, was the other kind entirely. The kind that fills rooms the way water fills a boot. Slowly, then all at once, until you cannot remember what it felt like to be dry. She had been married to Preston Hargrove for 6 years. 6 years of setting the table for two and eating alone when he worked late, which was most evenings. 6 years of keeping the household accounts in a leather journal she bought herself, because no one had asked her to, but someone had to, and she had learned early that someone was always going to be her. 6 years of pressing his shirts, and mending his cuffs, and knowing the name of every servant in their employ, and the name of every servant's mother, because Isobel believed that people deserved to be known. Preston did not share this belief. Preston believed that people deserved to be useful, and that when they ceased being useful, they ceased to be of particular interest. She had wondered, more than once, in which category he placed her. The marriage had been arranged the way most of their kind were arranged in that circle of old Virginia money, over a dinner her father hosted in the spring of 1883. With 2 bottles of Burgundy and an understanding that the Carver name needed the Hargrove connections, and the Hargrove estate needed the Carver capital. Isobel had been 23. She had worn a blue dress. She had smiled when spoken to, which was what was expected, and she had said yes when asked, which was also what was expected, and she had told herself that affection could be built the way a house is built. Carefully over time with good materials and patience. She had been wrong about that. But she had been a good wife. She wanted that on the record, if records were being kept. She had been a genuinely good wife, not in the diminished way people sometimes mean when they say it. Obedient, quiet, ornamental. But in the real way. She had managed a household of 11 people with something close to grace. She had hosted his business associates, and remembered their wives' names and their children's birthdays. She had sat beside him at every dinner party and every church service and every civic function. And she had been warm and clever and appropriate. And she had never once, not once, embarrassed him. She would think about that later, walking down a road with her feet starting to blister. She had never once embarrassed him. He had not extended her the same consideration. It happened on a Thursday evening in August, 3 weeks before her 29th birthday. Preston had 2 friends visiting from Baltimore, a cotton broker named Fowler, and a lawyer named Prentice, whom Isobel had always found slippery in the way of men, who are very careful about what they say. They arrived at 4 in the afternoon, and Isobel had seen to the guest rooms, and arranged for supper to be laid in the dining room, and had sat with the men for the first hour, while they drank bourbon on the back porch, and talked about nothing of substance. At 7:30, she excused herself, citing the headache she had learned was a socially acceptable reason for a woman to absent herself from male company. And she went upstairs to the sitting room at the end of the hall, the one that overlooked the garden, where she kept her embroidery and her books. She did not have a headache. She simply did not want to spend another 2 hours watching Fowler talk with his mouth full. She was reading a novel she had borrowed from her friend Agnes Whitmore, something Agnes had said she absolutely must read before they saw each other again. When she heard the men come inside, the windows were open. It had been a brutal August, and even at 8 in the evening the air barely moved, and the sitting room shared a wall with the study below, which meant that if the study windows were also open, and voices were raised even slightly, the sound carried. She was not trying to listen. She once that understood. She was reading, and then she was not, because she heard her name. Not her full name, just Isobel. Said in a particular tone. She set the book down. Isobel tries, Preston was saying. There was something in his voice, a loose ease, the bourbon working on him, that she had not heard before. Or perhaps she had and had simply never been in a position to hear it plainly. God knows she tries. That's the whole trouble with her, really. You can see the effort. Every single day, you can see how hard she is working at it. A pause. Ice against glass. Working at what? Fowler asked. At being. Preston seemed to search for the word. Beloved. She's working very hard at being beloved. It's exhausting to witness, honestly. Like watching someone trying to catch smoke. She heard Prentice laugh, a short, dry sound. She seems devoted enough. Oh, she's devoted, Preston agreed. Devoted like a hound is devoted. She's done everything right. Kept the house beautifully, never a word out of place in company, knows everyone's name and history back 3 generations. Excellent at the logistics of being a wife. Another pause, and then, more quietly, as if he were confiding something that half shamed him, even in the telling. I just never felt anything for her. I tried, in the beginning. But there's nothing there to feel. She loves me, I think. Or she thinks she does. But you can't manufacture the other side of it, can you? You can't make yourself feel what isn't there. Fowler said something Isobel couldn't catch, low and amused. I know, Preston said. Poor woman. Poor woman. Isobel sat very still in the upstairs sitting room for a long time after that. The novel was still open in her lap. She couldn't have said what page. The garden below the window was going dark, and the fireflies were starting, small cold lights moving in and out of the boxwood hedges, and she sat and looked at them and felt something shifting inside her chest. Not breaking. Not yet. Something more like a foundation that has been wet too long and is quietly beginning at last to give. She had known, she realized. She had always known. She had simply chosen, with great daily effort, not to know it consciously. She had kept it below the surface the way you keep a boat bailed out, constant small work to prevent the drowning. She thought about 6 years of that work. She thought about how tired she was. She turned the ring on her finger. The narrow gold band Preston's mother had chosen, because no one had asked Isobel what she wanted. She turned it once, twice, the way she sometimes did when she was thinking. And then very slowly she slid it off. She held it in her palm for a moment. It was lighter than she expected, for something that had weighed on her so long. She set it on the side table next to Agnes's novel. Then she stood up and went to her bedroom and packed a bag. She did not pack much. She had thought about this more than she would care to admit. Not in a planned way, not in the way of someone who had been plotting, but in the idle, desperate way you think about escape when escape seems impossible. She knew her wardrobe. She took 2-day dresses, both dark, both practical. She took her hairbrush and a bar of soap wrapped in paper. She took the small leather purse she kept in the drawer of her vanity, the one Preston didn't know about, because Preston had never once opened a drawer in her room. Inside the purse, $14.30. Her own money, earned in the only way available to a married woman of her station, small economies over many years. $1 here, $2 there. The difference between what the household accounts allocated for certain items and what those items actually cost, accumulated so slowly and so carefully that she herself had sometimes forgotten she was doing it. $14.30. She had no illusions about what $14.30 could do in the world. But she had somewhere to go, and that was more than a lot of women had. 3 months earlier, her friend Agnes had mentioned, almost in passing, that her cousin ran a small boarding house in Charlottesville. A proper place, respectable, but not expensive. Agnes had said it the way women sometimes say things to each other, with a particular weight beneath the ordinary words, a weight that says, I see you, and if you ever need it, here is a door. Isobel had stored it away. She had not known then that she would need it. She had simply known that it was wise to keep doors in mind. She wrote down the address in her own hand on a piece of paper she folded into her dress pocket. She went downstairs at 9:30. When she could hear the men still in the study, the low rumble of continued conversation, she went through the kitchen, nodding to the cook, Adeline, who was finishing the last of the washing up. Adeline looked at her, at the bag in her hand, at the set of her face, and something passed between them in the way things pass between women in households, wordless and complete. You going to be all right, Mrs. Hargrove? Adeline said. Isobel looked at her. Yes, she said, and then because it seemed important to say, thank you for everything all these years. You've been very kind to me. Adeline nodded once, her expression careful and private. Isobel walked out the back door into the August night. The air was thick and warm and smelled of honeysuckle from the neighbor's fence. She walked down the service lane behind the house, and then out onto the side street, and then onto the main road, and she kept walking, her bag in one hand and her whole life reshaping itself around her with every step. She had 3 miles to the train station. She had looked it up once, when she was imagining this, and telling herself she was only imagining. 3 miles on a warm night was entirely walkable, and she was a woman who had always kept herself in good health because she believed the body was the one thing that truly belonged to her. She walked for about 20 minutes before she heard the cart. It was an older man, a farmer by the look of him, heading back from the market with an empty wagon. He slowed when he saw her, a woman alone on the road at near 10 o'clock, and she could see him working out whether to be suspicious or helpful. Evening, he said. You all right, ma'am? I'm going to the train station, Isobel said. I wonder if you might be headed that way. He was. His name was August, he told her, August Freely, and he found the coincidence of his own name and the month amusing, as she could see from the way he said it, a small private smile. He drove her the rest of the way to the station without asking questions, which she appreciated more than she could say. At the station, she bought a ticket to Charlottesville with 3 of her $14. She sat on the wooden bench in the women's waiting room and watched the hands of the clock above the door. The train left at midnight. She had 2 hours. She did not cry. She felt she should note that, not as a point of pride but as a true thing. She did not cry. She had spent a great deal of the last 6 years quietly crying. In bathrooms, in linen closets, once memorably in the carriage house when she had thought no one was about, and had discovered that she was not as alone as she believed, because Adeline's nephew was there fixing a wheel, and had pretended not to see her, which was its own particular kindness. She had used up a great many tears already. What she felt now, waiting in the train station, was something different, something cooler, something that felt, tentatively, like the first breath of open air. Agnes Whitmore met her at the Charlottesville station. This was both surprising and entirely unsurprising, which is perhaps the nature of true friendship. Isobel had written a letter 2 days before, not a dramatic letter, not a letter that spelled anything out clearly, but a letter that said, "I may need to take you up on what you mentioned about your cousin, and if so I will arrive sometime this week, and I am sorry for the short notice." She had mailed it, and then tried not to think about whether it would arrive in time. It had arrived. Agnes was there, in her traveling hat, looking not at all as if she'd been woken at midnight, looking instead like a woman who had been perfectly prepared for exactly this. "You look thin," Agnes said, which was her way of saying, "I've been worried about you." "I'm fine," Isobel said, which was her way of saying, "I will be." Agnes's cousin was a widow named Mrs. Beatrice Fontaine, who ran the boarding house on Maple Street with a firm hand and a warm kitchen, and absolutely no tolerance for men who showed up unannounced, looking for women who did not wish to be found. She had a room with a window that looked out onto the street, a narrow bed with a good quilt, and a small writing desk. The room cost $4 a month. "How long do you need it?" Mrs. Fontaine asked, looking at Isobel with the particular appraising gaze of a woman who had seen a great many situations. "I don't know yet," Isobel said honestly. "That's fine," Mrs. Fontaine said. "Take the time you need." What she needed, she discovered, was to remember who she was before she became Preston Hargrove's wife. This sounds like a simple thing. It was not. She had been Isobel Carver before. Isobel Carver, who had read everything she could get her hands on, who had learned to keep accounts because her father trusted her with his ledgers when she was 15 and had discovered she had a mind for numbers. Isobel Carver, who had wanted once to do something with that mind. Not in any dramatic way, not in the way of the women she had read about in books who sailed to Africa or testified before Congress. Just something. Something more than setting a beautiful table in an empty room. On her second day in Charlottesville, Agnes took her to meet a woman named Helen Marsh, who ran a small school for the daughters of working families in the town. Helen was 45 and sharp-eyed and had the manner of someone who had long since stopped being interested in what people thought of her, which Isobel found deeply attractive. "Agnes tells me you're good with figures," Helen said. "I've managed household accounts for 6 years," Isobel said. "Before that I assisted my father. I need someone to teach arithmetic and correspondence writing. The girls here need practical skills more than they need poetry, though I have nothing against poetry." Helen looked at her steadily. "Can you do that?" Isobel thought of 6 years of managing a complex household, of tracking expenditures to the penny, of writing letters on Preston's behalf because his own correspondence was embarrassingly imprecise. She thought of everything she had taught herself in the hours between his departure in the morning and his return, or non-return, in the evening. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." The pay was small. $11 a month, which after her room at Mrs. Fontaine's left her $7, which was not a great deal, but was more than she'd had at certain moments in her childhood, and her father had always said that the difference between poverty and sufficiency was not always money but resourcefulness, and she had always been very resourceful. She began on a Monday morning. She taught 12 girls between the ages of 9 and 16. She taught them to add columns of figures without their lips moving, and to write a clear business letter, and to read a contract well enough to understand what it said. She taught them to ask questions and to expect answers. She told them, once, in a moment that surprised even her, that the most important thing a woman could know was the value of her own labor, not in a sentimental way, but in a practical one. "Know what you can do," she told them, "and then know what it is worth, and do not let anyone pay you less than that." One of the girls asked her, "How do you know what it's worth?" And Isobel said, You look at what it costs them when you don't do it. She thought about that answer for several days afterward. She found it satisfying in a way she had not expected. Preston came to Charlottesville 5 weeks after she left. She had half expected it and half not. She knew him well enough to know that what injured him was not her absence. She did not believe, after that Thursday evening in August, that her absence caused him personal grief, but the fact of the leaving, the decision. The statement implicit in a woman who packs a bag and walks out a door. I have weighed you and found you insufficient. That, she knew, would sting in a way that mere loneliness could not. He found her at the school, which surprised her. She had expected him to find the boarding house first. Mrs. Fontaine had apparently pointed him very calmly in the right direction when he arrived, which was either generous or strategic, and Isobel suspected it was strategic. She was in the middle of a lesson when he appeared in the doorway. She looked at him across the room, across the desks where 12 girls had all stopped writing to watch, and felt almost nothing. Not anger, not grief, not the old flinching anxiety she had carried. So long she had stopped recognizing it as anxiety. Just a clear, quiet steadiness, the way a pond looks when the wind has stopped. I'll be with you in a moment, she said, and turned back to her class and finished the lesson, which took 15 minutes. He waited. She had not been sure he would. They spoke in the hallway. He was well dressed, as always, and looked as if he had not slept well, which was perhaps the most honest she had ever seen him appear. Isobel, he said, come home. She looked at him with genuine curiosity. Why? He seemed genuinely taken aback by this question. She understood that he had been expecting something else. Tears, perhaps, or anger, or the kind of pleading that would have let him be magnanimous. He had not expected a simple and sincere why. Because you're my wife, he said. I know what I am, she said. What I'm asking is why you want me to come back. You made your feelings quite clear last month, and I found I agreed with your assessment, which was the most useful thing you've said to me in 6 years. He had the grace, at least, to understand what she meant. She watched something move across his face. Not remorse. She didn't think, but perhaps the beginning of comprehension. What do you want? He asked, after a moment. I'm doing it, she said. He looked past her into the schoolroom, where 12 girls were making a great show of not listening. He looked at the chalkboard, still covered in her arithmetic. He looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time, at a woman who was standing in a space she had made for herself, and was not waiting for his approval of it. You can't stay here, he said, though he said it without conviction. I'm not certain you can stop me, she said. The law is complicated on this point, as you know. But I'll tell you what I think would be sensible, since sensible arrangements seem to be your preference. I am content to remain discreet about the nature of our separation. I have no interest in causing scandal. What I want is simply to be left to this. She gestured briefly at the room behind her. That's all. He left that afternoon. He did not come back. She heard from Agnes, some months later, that Preston had quietly told their mutual acquaintances that Isobel's health required her to remain in the country for an extended period. She appreciated, in a detached way, that he had chosen a story that preserved her dignity alongside his own. It was perhaps the most thoughtful thing he had ever done for her. She did not think about him often. She had more pressing things to think about. By the following spring, Helen Marsh's school had grown. 2 more girls had enrolled, one of them, the daughter of a freedwoman who had taught herself to read and wanted her daughter to go further. And Isobel taught that girl with particular attention because she recognized something in her. The same hunger to be competent in a world that kept telling her she wasn't supposed to need to be. Isobel also began, quietly, to offer informal lessons on Saturday mornings to women in the town who needed help with their correspondence or their figures. Women who had been widowed and found themselves suddenly responsible for businesses or farms they didn't know how to manage. Women leaving difficult situations who needed to understand what they owned and what they owed. She charged a sliding scale, which meant that the women who could pay paid, and the women who couldn't paid when they could, and somehow it more or less balanced. Agnes called it a school for practical independence. Isobel called it Saturday mornings. She had $7 in a new leather purse. She had a room with a window. She had 12, now 14, girls who were learning to know the value of their own work. She had, improbably and completely, enough. There was a night in late April, close to a year after she had walked out of her own kitchen door into the August dark, when Isobel sat at her small writing desk in the room on Maple Street and wrote a letter to her mother. Her mother was a practical woman who had built a practical life and had always been somewhat mystified by the depth of Isobel's feeling about things. They were not close in the way Isobel sometimes wished, but they wrote, and in the letters they managed a kind of honesty that had never quite been possible in person. She told her mother, in the letter, about the school. About Helen Marsh and Mrs. Fontaine and Agnes and August Freely, who had driven her to the station without asking questions. About the girl who could not yet divide fractions but who had written, last week, a letter of complaint to a merchant who had cheated her mother, clear and precise and exactly right. At the top of the page she wrote the date, April 22, 1890. She was 29 years old. She had $14 in her purse and a debt of exactly nothing. She sealed the letter and set it on the edge of the desk and looked out the window at the street below, where a yellow cat was making its way along the fence with the quiet authority of something that knows exactly where it belongs. She blew out the lamp. She had not felt this much like herself since before she could remember being anyone else.